The door hit her in the back on the way out. Not accidentally. Lester Vane did not do accidental things. He put his boot against the doorframe and shoved it open hard enough that the edge caught Nora Vane between the shoulder blades and sent her forward into the snow with her mother still in her arms. The old woman, 71 years old, 103 pounds, her left hip shattered in a wagon accident the previous autumn that had left her unable to stand without assistance, made no sound when they hit the ground. She had been making no sound for 3 days. Nora had stopped interpreting the silence as a good sign 2 days ago. The door shut behind them. The bolt drove home. Nora stayed on her knees in the snow for a moment, her mother's weight across her lap, and looked at the horizon. What she saw was nothing. Not the nothing of an empty landscape, but the specific nothing of a Dakota territory. January at 35 degrees below zero, a white-gray erasure of everything beyond 40 feet. The air so cold it had thickened into something that was not quite visible, but pressed against the eyes and the exposed skin of the face with a physical insistence that demanded immediate attention. The sun was somewhere above the overcast. It was providing light, but no heat whatsoever, the way a lantern provides light through a window without warming the room. She had no coat. Lester had taken it 3 weeks prior, along with the wool blanket she kept on the rope bed and the pair of elk-hide boots she had worn since October. He had taken these things with the calm, methodical efficiency of a man who has made a decision and is simply executing it. And when Nora had asked him why he was doing this, he had told her that a widow with a crippled mother was a liability. The claim could not sustain through a Dakota winter, and that she had until spring to make other arrangements. She had nodded and said nothing because Lester Vane was her late husband's brother, and the deed to the Black Hills claim was in his name, and the nearest law was 42 miles south in Deadwood. That had been 3 weeks ago. This morning, he had simply opened the door and pointed outside. Nora was 36 years old. She was wearing 2 wool dresses layered over each other, a pair of men's wool socks that had belonged to her husband, and a canvas work apron she had tied around her shoulders like a shawl. Her feet were wrapped in burlap feed sacks tied with twine over the wool socks. She had prepared for this the way a person prepares for something they cannot prevent, but can anticipate, not with hope, but with inventory. 2 days ago, when she saw how Lester was looking at her mother, she had begun moving things quietly. A tin cup into the folds of her outer dress, a folding knife with a 3-inch carbon steel blade into the waistband of the inner one, a half loaf of hard cornbread wrapped in a flour sack cloth pressed flat against the small of her back beneath both dress layers. She had also memorized the location of the cave. It was not a natural feature that most people in the Black Hills would have noticed or remembered. A low horizontal split in a sandstone outcropping 2 miles northeast of the Vane claim, visible only if you knew where to look along the ridge face above Whitetail Creek. Nora had found it the previous October while gathering late service berries along the creek bank, pressing through scrub pine to reach a second growth of berries she had spotted from the opposite bank. The opening was 3 feet high and perhaps 6 feet wide, narrowing to a tight crawl at the back, where the sandstone plates had settled against each other. Inside, the space was large enough for 2 people to sit upright and 1 to lie flat. The floor was dry sand. The walls were dry stone. No wind reached the interior. She had gone back twice in November to confirm what she thought she remembered. Both times the cave had been exactly as she recalled, dry, still, and holding a temperature noticeably warmer than the outside air. Not warm. Warmer. In a Dakota January at 35 below, the difference between those 2 words was the difference between dead and not dead. Yet, and Nora Vane understood this with the precision of a woman who had been doing that particular arithmetic in her head for 3 weeks. She got her mother upright. Ruth Casper, Nora's mother, born in Ohio in 1812, carried west by a husband who died of cholera outside Fort Pierre in 1867, and who had spent the 16 years since demonstrating a stubbornness about remaining alive that Nora had always found both admirable and occasionally exhausting, opened her eyes when Nora pulled her to a sitting position and looked at her daughter with an expression that was not fear and was not confusion. It was the expression of a woman who has already assessed the situation and arrived at the relevant conclusions and is waiting to see what happens next. Nora got her mother onto her back. Ruth weighed 103 pounds. 2 miles of Black Hills terrain in 35 below zero, with a woman on her back and burlap sacks on her feet, and no coat, was not a calculation Nora allowed herself to complete in full. She stood up under the weight, found her footing in the packed snow, and pointed herself northeast toward Whitetail Creek. She did not look back at the cabin. She did not look back once. The first half-mile was the worst, not because the terrain was steepest there or because the wind hit hardest from that particular direction. It was worst because the cabin was still visible behind her. Nora could feel it at her back, the way a person feels a source of heat from across a room. Not warmth exactly, but the memory of warmth. The knowledge that 4 walls and a roof existed within reversible distance, and that every step northeast was a step that made reversing harder. She did not turn around. She fixed her eyes on the tree line above Whitetail Creek, and she walked. Ruth rode her daughter's back in silence with both arms locked around Nora's neck and her shattered hip pressed against the small of Nora's back in a way that sent a specific grinding ache up through Nora's spine with every step. Not Ruth's fault. The hip had been set badly by the Deadwood doctor, who had charged $4 for the service and delivered results that a more honest man might have been embarrassed by. The bone had knit at the wrong angle, leaving Ruth's left leg 2 inches shorter than the right, and the joint itself grinding on every movement like a wagon wheel with a cracked hub. Ruth had not complained about this once in 4 months. She did not complain about it now. The snow was crusted. That was both good and bad in proportions that shifted with every step. A hard crust meant Nora's weight sometimes held on the surface, and she covered ground cleanly, the burlap sacks on her feet gripping the ice crystals with reasonable traction. Then the crust gave without warning, and she punched through to her knee in loose powder beneath, lurching forward and catching herself with one hand on the snow surface, Ruth's weight shifting hard to one side, both of them nearly going down. It happened 4 times in the first quarter mile. By the 5th time, Nora had developed a compensating technique, a slight lateral roll of each step that distributed her weight across a wider surface area and reduced the frequency of breakthrough without eliminating it entirely. She had learned this from watching deer cross crusted snow. She had watched them do it on the creek flat below the claim the previous winter, and had thought at the time that it was an interesting thing to observe. She was grateful now for the observation. The temperature at 35 below zero does specific things to exposed skin that a person does not fully appreciate until it is happening to them. The face goes first, not painfully at the outset, but with a progressive numbness that starts at the cheekbones and moves inward toward the nose and mouth in a way that feels, initially, almost like relief from the sting of the cold air. Nora knew this feeling was not relief. She had grown up in Dakota territory. She knew that numbness in the face at 35 below was the skin beginning to die in small increments, and that the correct response was not to accept the relief, but to fight it. She pulled the outer wool dress up over her nose and mouth and breathed through the fabric, the moisture from her breath condensing immediately in the weave and forming a thin frost layer that paradoxically added a small measure of insulation. Ruth's face was against Nora's neck. That was good. The contact transferred marginal warmth in both directions and kept Ruth's cheeks and nose out of the direct air. Nora could feel her mother's breath on her collar, shallow and slow, but steady, the rhythm of a woman conserving rather than failing. The creek appeared below the ridgeline at what Nora estimated was the mile mark. She could not see it. She could hear it, a low, intermittent creak beneath the ice, the sound of water still moving in the deepest channel under 2 feet of frozen surface, audible only in the brief intervals when the wind dropped enough to let other sounds through. She angled down the ridge, face toward the sound, picking her route. Through the scrub pine with her eyes fixed on the ground 3 feet ahead, reading the snow surface for crust thickness, the way a man reads river ice before trusting his weight to it. She went down twice on the ridge descent. The first time she got her right hand out and caught herself clean, Ruth grunting once with the impact, but holding her grip around Nora's neck. The second time she went down harder, both knees hitting simultaneously, and stayed down for a moment with her hands flat on the snow surface and her breath coming in hard white clouds, while she assessed whether anything had broken or given way. Nothing had. She got up and kept moving. The sandstone outcropping was where she had left it. It appeared through the scrub pine exactly as she had memorized it, a low gray face of layered rock above the creek bank, the horizontal split running across its middle like a dark line drawn with deliberate care. The opening was partially drifted at the base, but the drift was loose and shallow, 2 inches of wind-deposited powder that Nora cleared with 3 sweeps of her forearm. She lowered Ruth from her back with her last reliable reserve of strength, getting her mother's feet to the ground first, and then easing her down against the rock face while she cleared the entrance. She got Ruth inside first, pulling her through the low opening on the dry sand floor with both hands under her arms, Ruth pushing with her good leg against the rock face to help. Then Nora went in herself, pulling the flour sack cloth from around the cornbread and pressing it flat across the opening behind her to block the wind. The air inside the cave changed immediately. Not warm. Warmer. The specific dimensioned warmth of enclosed stone that has been holding the Earth's residual heat against the outside cold. Winter, and has not yet given it all away. Nora sat against the back wall with her mother against her chest and pulled both dress layers tight around them both, and for the first time since the cabin door had hit her in the back. That morning she stopped moving. Ruth said her first words in 3 days. She said she was hungry. Nora broke the cornbread in half and gave her mother the larger piece. The second night was the decision point, not the first night. The first night Nora had been running on the specific fuel that extreme situations provide, the narrowed focus, the suppressed shaking, the body's emergency reserve that kicks in when options collapse to one. She had organized the cave in the last gray light of the first afternoon, pulling dead pine branches from the scrub outside the entrance and piling them against the right wall for insulation and fuel, packing loose snow into the tin cup and holding it against her stomach under both dress layers until it melted to drinking water, positioning herself and Ruth against the back wall where the stone held the most residual warmth, and the ceiling was low enough to trap their body heat in the space above them. She had done all of this without stopping, because stopping meant thinking. and thinking meant arithmetic. And the arithmetic of 2 women in a Dakota Territory cave in January was not arithmetic that rewarded extended examination. The second night she stopped, and the arithmetic arrived. She had half a loaf of cornbread remaining after the first day. Ruth's appetite had returned with the shelter and the rest, which was encouraging, and also meant the food was going faster than a single person's ration would have gone. She had the folding knife, the tin cup, and the flour sack cloth covering the entrance. She had pine branches enough for 2 more small fires, if she was careful about sizing and duration. She had no means of signaling. She had no means of traveling further in Ruth's current condition. The nearest occupied claim besides the Vane homestead was the Aldrich family, 3 miles south along the creek, and 3 miles south meant passing within a quarter mile of Lester Vane's front door. She lay against the cave wall in the dark and worked through the problem the way her father had taught her to work through problems, not from the worst outcome backward, but from the available resources forward. What did she have? What could each thing do? What was the correct sequence? She had the cave itself. Dry stone, enclosed air, earth temperature holding the interior at what she estimated was 15 to 18 degrees above the outside ambient. Not survivable indefinitely without additional heat. Survivable for days, which was a different and more useful calculation. She had pine branches. Small fire meant warmth and the ability to melt snow for water. Small fire in a low enclosed space also meant smoke management. She had tested this on the first afternoon, burning a bundle of dry needles near the entrance and watching the smoke behavior. The cave's natural draft pulled air from the back and vented it low across the entrance opening, which meant a fire built at the entrance edge would draft outward rather than inward. She had adjusted the flour sack cloth accordingly, leaving a 4-inch gap at the bottom where the draft ran strongest. She had the knife. A 3-inch carbon steel blade could process small game if small game presented itself, which in a Dakota January at 35 below was not a reliable proposition, but was not an impossible one either. Rabbits moved in the scrub pine, even in hard cold, pushed by hunger to daytime activity that made them visible against the snow surface. She had seen 3 on the descent to the creek the previous morning, and had noted their runs, the packed channels in the snow surface where the same animals traveled the same routes repeatedly, which was the rabbit's efficient habit, and, in a survival situation, its primary liability. She built a snare from a strip cut off the bottom of her inner wool dress on the morning of the second day. It took 4 attempts over 2 hours, her fingers losing dexterity in the cold outside the cave entrance and requiring repeated warming against her stomach before she could work the knot sequences with the necessary precision. The snare itself was a simple fixed loop set across the most heavily packed rabbit run she had identified, propped open with a small twig trigger. Anchored to a scrub pine root, with 3 half hitches she tested with her full grip strength before trusting them. She caught a rabbit on the morning of the 3rd day. It was a snowshoe hare, 2.5 pounds dressed weight, and Nora processed it outside the cave entrance with the folding knife in 11 minutes flat, working fast before her hands stiffened completely, burying the offal in the snow away from the cave to avoid drawing predator attention to the entrance. She cooked it over a small pine branch fire in the tin cup with packed snow, cutting the meat into pieces small enough to fit the cup's diameter. And when the water boiled, she fed the broth to Ruth first, and the meat second, and ate what remained herself, standing up. Ruth's color improved by the 4th day. The rest and the food, and the cave's sheltered stillness, had done what the Deadwood doctor's $4 medicine had not managed in 4 months. It had given Ruth Casper's 71-year-old body a set of conditions under which it could apply its own considerable resources to the problem of continuing to exist. She was not recovering. She was stabilizing, which in a Dakota cave in January was the more important of the two. On the 5th day, Nora reset the snare and caught nothing. On the 6th day, she reset it and caught a second hare, smaller than the first, and rationed it across 2 days with the discipline of a woman who has done the arithmetic enough times to know exactly what the margin is and has no intention of spending past it. The temperature broke on the morning of the 8th day, not to warmth, to survivable. The outside air climbed from 35 below to 12 below between dawn and mid-morning, a differential Nora felt through the cave entrance as a physical loosening of the cold's grip, not gone, but reduced, pulled back from the specific threshold where exposed skin died in minutes to the threshold where a person moving at pace could manage it with adequate clothing. She had spent the previous 2 days preparing for exactly this. She had cut strips from the outer wool dress and wrapped them around Ruth's hands and feet in addition to her own. She had repacked the burlap feed sacks on her feet and added a layer of dry pine needles between the burlap and the wool sock, a trick she had read about in a fur trapper's account published in a Deadwood newspaper the previous winter, and had filed away in the part of her mind that stored information against future need. She had eaten the last of the second hare that morning and cleaned the tin cup and put it back in the fold of her dress. She got Ruth onto her back at mid-morning, 3 miles south to the Aldrich claim. She had done 2 miles in 35 below on the first day, carrying this same weight on this same back with burlap on her feet and no preparation time. 12 below with 2 days of rest and 8 days of hard-won knowledge of her own capacity was a different proposition. Not easy. Different. The Aldriches saw her coming across the creek flat from 200 yards out. Thomas Aldrich came out of his cabin at a run and reached her at the fence line and took Ruth's weight off her back without asking, and carried Ruth the last 40 yards to the door while his wife Vera held it open. Nora walked the last 40 yards under her own weight for the first time in 8 days and stepped across the threshold into a room with a working cast-iron stove and sat down on the floor directly in front of it, and did not move for a long time. Vera Aldrich put coffee in her hands. Nora held it without drinking for a moment, feeling the heat move through the tin cup into her palms, and looked at the stove. Thomas came back from settling Ruth on the bed in the back room and stood in the doorway and asked what had happened. Nora told him in plain sequence without editorializing, the same way she had told herself the story every night in the cave, as a set of facts in the correct order with no unnecessary weight attached to any of them. Thomas listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he put on his coat and his hat and picked up the .4-40 Winchester leaning beside the door and told Vera he was riding to Deadwood. Nora did not ask why. She already knew why. She drank the coffee and watched the stove and listened to Ruth breathing steadily from the back room, and outside the temperature continued its slow climb toward something a person could live in. Lester Vane was arrested at his claim the following morning on charges of criminal abandonment, filed by Thomas Aldrich at the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office in Deadwood. The claim deed was contested in territorial court that spring on grounds of fraud and unlawful dispossession. The proceedings took 4 months. Nora won. Ruth Casper lived to 83. She never fully recovered the use of her left hip. She never once suggested that the 8 days in the cave had been anything other than manageable. She was from Ohio. She had crossed the Missouri River behind a man who died of cholera and had kept going west anyway. A Dakota cave in January was not the hardest thing Ruth Casper had ever done. It was not even close.